In October of 2017, Robert Warwick, an astronomer at the Haleakala Observatory in Hawaii, turns his telescope to an object that's moving through our solar system. It's a large object, maybe a comet, maybe an asteroid. And soon, astronomers at observatories all over the world begin to turn their telescopes towards this object that's passing through our solar system. It's not really moving like an asteroid. It's not moving like a comet. It's actually not moving like any known natural object moves according to the laws of physics. And slowly, inexorably, and surely, the scientists all reach the same startling conclusion, that this object is an extraterrestrial vehicle, or maybe more precisely, a long-abandoned extraterrestrial vehicle whose occupants have long since moved on, maybe a piece of space junk from a much larger extraterrestrial vehicle, but an extraterrestrial vehicle nonetheless, moving through our solar system in September of 2017. Now, you think today's episode is a crackpot Silicon Valley guy who's got a theory? Well, my guest today is Avi Loeb. Avi Loeb was the chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department for years. He's a professor at Harvard. He is a member of the Center for Astrophysics at the Smithsonian. He's written a book called Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. It's a crazy story. You can't even believe it when you hear it. But here it is. Avi Loeb, this is Something Ventured. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Avi Loeb. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. I'll get maybe a third of your accomplishments down here, but he is the longest serving chairman of the Astronomy Department at Harvard University, where he's the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science. He's a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's written 4 books, over 700 scientific papers, and his current book is called Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. Did I miss any big ones there?
Well, I don't regard any of these labels as important. In fact, I do trace my origins to being a kid on a farm, and I haven't changed much since then. So you might as well just refer to me as a farm boy.
And what farm in Israel, is that right?
Yes, and we used to have chicken. I used to collect eggs every afternoon, and on weekends I would go to the hills of the village and read philosophy books. That was the most interesting subject for me.
And from there, what is the path? Like, when do you end up in astronomy? When do you look to the sort of the stars and start thinking about it? Is it you're reading science fiction, or you're looking at the sky, or following the astronauts? Or
Not really. I had in Israel, there is an obligatory military service, and I had 2 options: either to run in the fields with a gun or to do intellectual work. And the latter was closer to philosophy. And so I ended up doing physics. I was good at physics, and initiated the project that was supported by the Star Wars initiative of President Reagan. And it was the first international project supported by that program. And that brought me to Washington, D.C. And in one of the visits, I went to Princeton and eventually ended up with an offer for a 5-year fellowship there, under the condition that I'll switch to astrophysics. So the entire vocabulary of astrophysics was foreign to me, and I didn't know how the sun shines. So it took me several years to define myself, to actually learn the subject. And then after that, I was offered a junior faculty position at Harvard that nobody wanted because the chance of getting tenure were quite small. And I wasn't worried about it because I had plan B. I could always go back to the farm. And I ended up being tenured there 3 years later, and then became the chair of the department about 14 years after that. Once I got tenured at Harvard, I realized, even though it's an arranged marriage that was a result of circumstances, I'm actually married to my true love, in the sense that astrophysics addresses deep philosophical questions in a scientific way. And we are very privileged to think about the sky and get paid for it.
Yeah. And as you get started, well, first of all, let me ask you, as your kid on the farm in Israel, is something going on? Is like any of the moon missions or any of that going on? And is that in your field of memory, or is that just a separate?
Well, I do remember the Apollo program, and that it was exciting. And, I was good in physics, but I was really mostly interested in the deep philosophical questions about our existence, not so much in the stars and the sky. I mean, I did read some reports about, the frontiers in astrophysics, but, they were of secondary importance. And I was mostly entrenched in books that dealt with existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And in retrospect, that shaped my work in science as well, because I'm particularly curious about the big picture. And many of my colleagues develop expertise in a very narrow niche, and the risk of doing that is that you often get to the bedrock of that niche, and you can't really dig much farther than that, and then you get stuck. But if you have a broader view, you find a way to maneuver around this bedrock and find new territories of interest. And moreover, if there is a peculiar fact, like the discovery of the first interstellar object that doesn't quite conform to what we've seen before, then you can think outside the box. Just to give you an example about thinking outside the box, I mean, that pretty much characterizes me as a person. I used to visit this town in Germany, university town, where they would put me in a hotel room that had the slanted ceiling. I couldn't really stand up in the shower. I was frustrated by this very narrow space. And at some point I decided, I'll book a double room. I got there, and the receptionist said, "Oh, your wife is not coming with you. I'll give you a single room." I said, no. I really need the space. I'm coming from the US, their space is quite ample. And then I asked my host, how is it possible that you have so little space in those hotel rooms? And they said, well, the reason is simple. We have a rule in this town that no building should be taller than the church. And so I immediately said, well, why don't you make the church taller? And they said, we haven't thought about it. So, for centuries,
Right.
they've been living under this rule, and they've never thought about making the church taller so that they'll have more space.
That's fantastic. How do you, and I want to get to the object that came by, but the thing that has always struck me about astronomy as you start doing it is just getting your mind around the scale of it. Like what a billion means and what a billion galaxies could possibly, I just, how fast a light year must be. And then the fact that things are 1,000 light years apart, it just feels like the scale is hard for a human to understand.
Well, it's just bigger. And I think the one lesson you learn from practicing astronomy for decades is a sense of modesty. At least that's what I learned. Some of my colleagues are still arrogant, so apparently they haven't gotten the message. But the message I got very clearly from the sky is stay modest. First of all, because Earth is one out of a zeta number of planets similar to it, like 10 to the power 21, more than the number of grains of sand on all beaches on Earth. So if you do anything on Earth, if you accomplish anything, even if you are the wealthiest person on Earth, like Elon Musk, I mean, that's just like an ant hugging a single grain of sand on the landscape of a huge beach. It's not very impressive. You can never be proud of yourself because you are representing such a small piece of the entire picture, Right. And we also live for a short time. There used to be a person next to the Roman Caesars whose task was to tell them, don't forget that you are mortal, because some of them, after winning a war, would become quite arrogant. And, the fact that we live for one part in 100 million of the age of the universe means that, we take part in such a small piece of the entire play. We are put on this stage without a script. It's just like, an actor that is put on a stage without a script. We don't know what we are here for, what the meaning of life is. And we live just for one part in 100 million of the entire play, that. Don't forget that. And what I advocate in my book is, are there other actors out there? Isn't that a fundamental question you want to ask when you are an actor in a play, that you want to know if there are other actors and what they're doing, and that will at least give you some perspective about your role in that play. And when my colleagues say it's never aliens, they basically deny the possibility that there are actors out there.
Right. And so the thing, it seems to me that if you're a reasonable, educated, you kind of think it through, the idea that there's like 50 billion planets in our own galaxy that are similar environments to Earth, the idea that we're alone, it seems fairly unlikely. I mean, you have to be fairly egotistical.
I think it's arrogant, frankly, to say that we are unique and special. I mean, it sort of reminds me of my daughters when they were infant. They used to be at home and they thought that they're the smartest and that they're the center of the world. Then we took them to the kindergarten and they immediately recognized, that they're not necessarily the smartest. And that was a psychological shock. And if you were to ask them at the time, they would tell you that they would much rather stay at home. Right. And of course, that's a natural tendency of humans to, starting with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, to argue we are at the center of the world. And then we realized, thanks to Copernicus and Galileo, that no, actually the Earth moves around the sun, but a lot of scientists still maintain that, we're really special and unique. And I
wouldn't look in the telescope, right?
Yeah, exactly. I find it hard to believe because, half of the sun-like stars we know now, as of last year, based on the Kepler satellite data, that half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. Not only that we are not at the center of the universe, but what we find in our backyard, the Earth-Sun system, is quite common. As you said, there are billions of such systems. And if you repeat the same circumstances, you might as well get similar outcome. At least that should be the common sense. That should be the mainstream default view. But instead, what happens right now in the scientific culture is that scientists argue, no, show me extraordinary evidence before I'll believe this extraordinary claim. Now, my point, it's not extraordinary. This is the common sense. It should be the default assumption, and then let's just search. And by the way, we're searching for the dark matter of the universe. We don't know what most of the matter is. We search for gravitational waves. Each of these endeavors cost us $1 billion. It's a lot of money. You need to put that money before you start getting results. And claiming that we need extraordinary evidence without putting in the money, the search for technological signatures is not funded at a level that is 1,000 times smaller by the federal funding agencies. And and when you fund it 1,000 times less, obviously you will not see anything. And when you ridicule this possibility that we might not be alone, whenever someone brings it up, then obviously young talent will not enter this search. And it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's quite unfortunate to find that in the scientific culture, given that the public is so interested in that and the public funds science. And frankly, I find the private sector, the commercial sector, much more risk-taking, much more open-minded about innovation. And you might think it should have been the other way around, because organizations that are for profit should take less risks in principle, right? But how is it possible that the academia, that is not for profit, discourages innovation? And to me, it's something to do with the fact that the rewarding system is not set right. People are being rewarded, at least in physics right now, for demonstrating that they are smart rather than describing nature. So they're not putting skin in the game. They're not taking any risks. They're just doing mathematical gymnastics and show that they're smart, rather than explain something that we can observe, some experimental fact. And it used to be the tradition of physics, but it's not anymore.
So what is the answer to, or your thoughts on the question? So 50 billion, however many, we can't possibly be alone. And then after a couple glasses of wine, you get to, okay, so why hasn't some civilization several thousand years more advanced than us shown up? Like it's
Right.
always us going out to them. Like, why haven't they shown up and said, boy, we're so far ahead of you? And
Well, this is called the Fermi's paradox. And frankly, once again, I find it arrogant. It's presumptuous because when I met my wife, she had many friends that used to wait for Prince Charming on a white horse that will come over and make them a marriage proposal. And, that never happened. So why are we so presumptuous to assume that we deserve a visit? I don't think that we are that special and worthy of a visit because we developed our technologies only over 100 years. Okay, and so the news didn't really break out yet about how interesting we might be. And frankly, things like us probably existed for billions of years. There were other civilizations because most stars formed billions of years before the sun. So they went through the same process of technological civilizations coming out. And I think that we are just like ants on a sidewalk, one out of many. And when you walk down the street, you don't pay attention to each of them. So there are several reasons for why we might not have evidence for someone visiting us. One is, technological civilizations are short-lived. We develop the means for our own destruction. We change the climate and so forth. And so if they are very short-lived, like several centuries, the chance of you being alive exactly at the time that they are alive is quite small. This is called the great filter, and I discuss it in my book. Another possibility is, that most of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy are much smaller than the sun. They are dwarf stars, and they emit infrared radiations. So just imagine creatures that have infrared eyes, that are used to infrared light. Interstellar tourist agencies will never advertise the Earth as a desired destination because all we can offer them in our vacation sites is green grass illuminated by visible light. And this light hurts their eyes, and they're used to dark red grass. So why would they ever come here? We have to go there and entice them to come. Now, there is a third possibility, which I call social distancing on a cosmic scale. And I came across this idea during the pandemic. You can imagine very advanced civilizations that close themselves off in a cocoon. They don't want to get in contact with lesser civilizations because that would degrade their quality of life. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn about them because according to the second law of thermodynamics, they must deposit some trash. And, just like investigative journalists that go through the trash cans of celebrities in Hollywood, we could go through their trash and learn about their private lives.
Right. So is it likely that if there is another, as there likely are other civilizations, that the math of the thing is that they would end up, and I'm getting this from science fiction, but there's the concept that that a civilization would be so different from us. It would be a web. It would be something that we couldn't even recognize it because it was so different. Or is it the case that, well, now you look at the chemistry and the physics of the thing, you probably end up with a couple legs and a head,
No, I completely agree with your first point that it's very likely that if we ever encounter a biological creature from another world, that it would look really shocking because when we meet another person, it's a safe assumption to assume the person looks roughly like us because we share a common genetic heritage. But when you meet life from another planet, if that planet has no contact with Earth, it could have developed very differently in the sense that, you open recipe books for cakes and you see that out of the same ingredients, you can make very different cakes depending on how you mix the ingredients, how much heat you apply. So starting from the same soup of chemicals on different planets that went through different histories, you might end up with very different forms of life. But I should say that much more likely than meeting creatures, is the possibility that we will find relics of other civilizations. And, the discovery of the first interstellar object, which is called Oumuamua, that I discuss in my book, basically is a wake-up call that we should consider the possibility of detecting equipment in space. And we've been, for 70 years, we've been looking for radio signals from other civilizations. That's similar to trying to have a phone conversation. For that, you need the counterpart to be alive. We can't have a phone conversation with the Mayans. The Mayan culture is gone by now, but we can learn about it through archaeological digs, by finding the relics that they left behind. And in much the same way, we can find more about all these dead civilizations out there in space that are not around anymore, that existed billions of years ago, and sent out equipment into space, just like we did, the Voyager 1, Voyager 2, New Horizons, and the space should be filled with those pieces of equipment that may not be functional anymore, just like, plastic bottles on a beach among all the rocks that you see that are naturally produced. But they, even though they're not functional, they will provide us with a message about, what this civilization might have been like. And, we can even land on such a piece of equipment and read off the label, made on planet X. And maybe we can even import the technology if it's much more advanced than what we have right now. If it's 1 million years more advanced, by importing it to Earth, we can save 1 million years. That's quite a major, it could be much more financially beneficial than waiting for Silicon Valley to invent it.
Right. So and this is just fascinating. So what happened in 2017? What was the event that's led to this book, Extraterrestrial?
Right. So in October 19th, 2017, the first object that came from outside the solar system was discovered near Earth. And we sort of knew that it came from outside because it was moving too fast relative to the sun. So it was not bound to the sun like the planets are. And it was discovered by Pan-STARRS, a telescope in Maui, Hawaii, that and given the name Oumuamua, that means a scout, a messenger from far away. And at first, astronomers assumed that it must be either a comet or an asteroid. The type of rocks that we find in the solar system, just from another star. They were kicked from another planetary system. But as time went on, this object looked weirder and weirder. It didn't look like a comet because it didn't have any trail of gas or dust around it. And the Spitzer Space Telescope looked very deeply around it and put a very tight limit on carbon-based molecules or dust. So it wasn't a comet for sure. Not only we couldn't see it visually as a comet, but the limits are really tight. And then the reflection of sunlight from it as it was tumbling implied that it has a very extreme shape because the brightness of reflected sunlight changed by a factor of 10. We couldn't resolve it. We couldn't take an image of it because it was just the size of a football field, a few hundred feet, at a distance which is a fraction of the distance to the sun.
And is it gone at this time, or is it still, like, are people seeing this in real time, or is it recorded and somebody goes and looks at the video and says, wait a minute, that's not...
So as of now, the object is 1 million times fainter than it was close to Earth. We can't really observe it anymore. And we can't chase it because it moved faster than any of the rockets that we have. But when we discovered it, it looked like a point of light that changes its brightness every 8 hours as it's tumbling. And the shape that was inferred is quite extreme. And in fact, the best shape was pancake-like, flat, to describe the light variation as it was tumbling, not cigar shape. So you can think of it as a piece of paper tumbling in the wind, kind of. And then at some point, it showed that its orbit deviated from an orbit shaped just by the sun's gravity. And, in the case of comets, that can happen as a result of the rocket effect. Some gas evaporates and gives it a push. But there was no gas around this object. And in order to get that push, you needed about 10% of the mass of this object to evaporate. So that could not be a viable explanation for the extra push. And this force that acted on it declined inversely with distance squared in a very smooth fashion, just like you expect from reflected sunlight. So I suggested that perhaps reflected sunlight is pushing it. And for that, the object needed to be very thin, sort of like a sail, except that nature doesn't make sails. So that suggested that it may be artificial. And in September 2020, there was another object discovered showing an excess push from the sun by reflecting sunlight and no cometary tail. It was discovered by the same telescope, Pan-STARRS, and was given the name 2020 SO. And then the astronomers that discovered it realized that it actually came from Earth. It's a rocket booster that was kicked into space in 1966 as part of the Lunar Lander Surveyor 2 mission. And we know that this object has thin walls, and that's why it had a large area for its weight, so it could be pushed by reflecting sunlight. And we know that we produced it and that it's artificial. We just don't know who produced Oumuamua.
Right. So is there somebody when Oumuamua like passes through, is there a first scientist who's the first person to say, because it seems like nobody is inclined to say this just doesn't make sense as a natural phenomenon. Was there somebody who stepped forward and said nothing else makes sense?
Well, that's me.
That's you.
Yeah, that scientist is me. And I wrote a Scientific American article in summer 2018, about 8 months after the discovery. And I summarized the 6 peculiar properties of Oumuamua and said, look, there are too many of them. And if you assign a 1% chance for each of these weird properties to represent a natural object that we have seen before, when you multiply 1% 6 times, you get 1 part in a trillion. So why would the first object be such a rarity, 1 part in a trillion? And after that, I wrote a scientific paper that was accepted for publication, suggesting that it may be a light sail, and that was accepted within a few days. And a couple of bloggers wrote about it, and then it became viral in the media.
And you became famous. And so it seems logical. It seems that you get to the point, if I understand correctly, that there's a 1 in a trillion chance that it's some strange phenomenon. And then the obvious thing, if we're in a universe probably teeming with life that would become intelligent and could create something, it just seems that the odds kind of tilt that way, that it just makes the most sense.
Yeah, and to me, it didn't sound like an unusual hypothesis. And frankly, it's a hypothesis. It's a proposal you put on the table, and then with more evidence, you can decide whether it's right or not. Even if we can't observe Oumuamua any longer, there should be many more like it. Because, when I go to the kitchen and I see an ant, I get alarmed. I know that there must be many more ants out there. So we observed the sky for a few years. We found Oumuamua with Pan-STARRS, and that means that every few years we'll find another one. There is no reason to expect that time frame to be privileged. And moreover, there is the Vera Rubin Observatory that will be much more sensitive than Pan-STARRS and should detect one every month. So my point is rather simple. When we detect those future weird objects, we should send a spacecraft with a camera that will come close enough to these objects and take a photograph, because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Right. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book.
Right. And so at what point did you kind of say this is more than a scientific paper? This is a book. This is a bigger thing.
Oh, I never said that. What happened was it got so much attention that, I had reporters calling me every day. But then at some point there were a few, there were about half a dozen filmmakers or documentary makers that contacted me, and producers. And at some point there were some literary agents that started to contact me, about a few of them. And I said, no, I'm a scientist. I don't have time to write a book right now. And one of them was insisting, she called me again and again. And at some point I said, okay, well, maybe I'll listen to her. And she ended up convincing me that it's worthwhile. And then I told my publisher, we had a book deal, and I told my publisher that one major reason that I'm writing this book is that I hope that if there is a person in the world that will read my book and as a result decide to become a scientist, that will give me the most satisfaction. So that's a worthwhile cause. And it so happens that a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from Malawi in Africa from a woman who said that she enjoyed my book. It's great, and it convinced her to perhaps become an astronomer.
Wow!
And so I wrote back and said and mentioned the story about my publisher and asked her, "Are you the one? Are you that person that will become a scientist as a result of reading my book?" And she said, "Maybe." And so I'm already satisfied. A week later, I got an email from Columbia, from an undergraduate student in physics who said that reading about my work changed her life.
Wow.
And a few days later, I got an email from a lawyer in Palo Alto saying that it's quite amazing, and saying good things about my. So I'm getting every day about a dozen emails from all over the world from people that reading the book makes a difference in their lives. And
it's
that to me is the most satisfying sense that let me give you another example or anecdote. My publicist, over the past 2 months, I had about 350 interviews, so back to back from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day over a couple of months. And at some point in the middle of it, the publicist said, "Great job, Avi, you're doing great. The book is now a bestseller on the New York Times list and internationally, and you're doing a great job with these interviews." And I corrected him and said, "Look, it's not about me trying to sell more copies of the book. I'm trying to convey a message, that I'm using this platform of communicating with the public in order to convey a message about the excitement that science can bring and the fact that we can address questions of interest to the public and so forth. And therefore, if the public wouldn't like my message, I wouldn't care less if the number of sales would drop as a result of me conveying this message. I'd still convey it. I don't care about how many copies I sell or how many likes I get on Twitter." And so he understood that and revised his approach in communicating with me afterwards.
It's an incredible book. I mean, you read it and it's just it's not, thriller is the wrong word because it's not fiction, but it just makes sense. It just flows from one idea to another, and you walk away from it without any particularly advanced science education, just getting it, just being kind of amazed at sort of what, and I know it happens all the time, but amazed at kind of what happened in 2017.
Right. I see science as a way of life. I don't see myself as privileged in any way. I don't see science as an occupation of the elite. I think it's a self-inflicted wound. The scientists distance themselves from the public. They work on subjects that are, very often are similar to counting how many angels can stand on a tip of a pin, and worry about things like extra dimensions, string theory that have no experimental verification. And it provides a sandbox for people to demonstrate how smart they are. They can do mathematical gymnastics and impress each other. But there are two questions. One is, are you describing nature? And the only way to find out is by doing experiments. And there is a whole culture of theoretical physicists that are completely divorced from contact with experiments, from putting skin in the game. And that's quite unfortunate in the current culture. But there is a second issue of, what are we trying to do? I mean, after all, we should be attentive to the public's interest. The public is funding science, and addressing a question like, are we alone? Are we the smartest kid on the block? That's something the public resonates with. How is it possible that addressing this question is underfunded by a factor of 1,000 or more compared to a question of, what is the nature of dark matter that will have zero impact
Right.
on our daily lives, or other gravitational waves in the universe. That cost the National Science Foundation $1.1 billion. Imagine if we were to invest $1 billion in the search for technological signatures. I'm sure we would make a lot of progress. But we already invested, a comparable amount of money in the search for dark matter. We haven't found the dark matter. Right. That's not considered a failure. That's part of we're searching in the dark. It's part of the mainstream activity. This subject of the search for, other kids on our block should receive similar or more funding, because the public cares about it, because it would have a huge impact on society if we find evidence that is conclusive. And somehow the current academic culture is exactly in the opposite place of where it should be on this subject.
And what is the push? SETI kind of gets pushed back. People like it seems fairly logical. It's not like a crazy idea that the odds of it being natural are very low. The odds of there being other civilizations are very high. Just with no skin in the game, just looking at it, it doesn't seem like a crazy idea. But there's resistance. Like, why?
Right, because I think it touches on our core existence, that if we find a smarter kid on the block, just like the psychological shock that my daughters had when going to the kindergarten, it will affect us quite at a deep level, because it will change our perception about our place in the universe, our aspirations for space. It will affect religious, philosophical beliefs. It will change our approach to each other as well. It will reflect on us in a very fundamental way. And so as a result, people are very reluctant to address it. There used to be in ancient history the notion that the human body has a soul, and some people still believe it. But back then, anatomy was forbidden in some groups of people, and then imagine the scientists saying, the human body is a controversial subject. Some people claim it has a soul and others deny it. We don't want to deal with it. Think about where modern medicine would be if we were to adopt this attitude. I think science has an obligation to address a subject of great interest and importance to the public using the scientific method and clear it up, rather than shy away from it just because it's controversial, just because there are science fiction stories in the context of the technological signatures, or just because there are unidentified flying object reports that may not be up to the standards of science. That has nothing to do with our ability to look at the sky and find relics of other civilizations using telescopes, using cameras that we deploy along trajectories of interstellar objects. So we can address this question scientifically and not be afraid of it and not ridicule anyone that discusses it. Because right now, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we won't find extraordinary evidence given the attitude that exists. And what I find really strange is that even the people engaged in the SETI community, in such a search, they're really very afraid of upsetting the rest of the community by discussing the possibility of much more funding, or arguing that this is just not right, because they are worried that the little funding they're getting will be cut even more. And they're very proud of the last decade or two where the funding went up maybe by a factor of 2 or 3. To me, that's ridiculous, because I'm talking about a factor of 1,000 or more, compared to the search for dark matter, or the search for gravitational waves, or other endeavors that are mainstream right now in science. I think this question is so big that we should fund it at the billion-dollar level on a national scale, a federal funding, right, rather than be worried about, what the mainstream is saying right now.
Are the Silicon Valley billionaires any help? Have any of them?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
They're all trying to get to Mars. I mean, are any of them? Well, maybe they'll pick up your book and put $1 billion towards something.
Well, there is one person that saw the light about 5 years ago, and that is Yuri Milner.
Yeah,
and he established the breakthrough initiatives that revolve around the search for life. in the universe, but that's one person. And, that's at the level of, let's say, 100 million or so in terms of searching for radio signals. But there needs to be much more support, and it needs to be much broader, and there needs to be a change in the culture of science. It's not just a matter of money, because you can pour money, but there wouldn't be any people pursuing it. What you want is talented, bright, young scientists engaged in that. Rather than going to write papers on extra dimensions and string theory, they should engage in the search for technological signatures. And once you get the talent combined with a funding that is at the level of $1 billion, I'm sure there would be some interesting results coming up.
Yeah. Well, I see a couple final things here. Is there any thought, Oumuamua, aside from being a, not just a naturally occurring phenomenon, what it might be? It's an engine that fell off something, or?
Right. So, if indeed it's the reflection of sunlight that gave it the push, it needs to be a very thin object. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a light sail. It could be a surface of a spaceship that was ripped apart and it's being pushed by reflecting sunlight. Most likely, the equipment that we find in space will be just junk, right. Not operational, because it would be billions of years old. Imagine Voyager 1, Voyager 2, 1 billion years from now. Yeah. Will be just floating in space. And so I think the key to understanding its purpose and its composition and nature and so forth would be to take a photograph. A photograph can tell us the difference between a rock and an artificial object. And then, if it looks interesting, we can land on it. The only way we will not know is if we keep repeating this mantra that it's always rocks and never aliens. And, that is similar to a caveman looking at a cell phone and saying it's a shiny rock.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. Does what you know about astronomy and physics, does that ruin science fiction for you? Like, can you read a science fiction book and enjoy it? Or do you have favorites?
No, well, yes, it ruins. I enjoy fiction. And I enjoy doing science. But what bothers me in some storylines is that they violate the laws of physics. They don't make sense given the knowledge that I have about physics. So I can't really enjoy the storyline. But there are some films, for example, that are not violating the laws of physics so much, and I enjoy them. Like, for example, Arrival, that was focused on the issue of linguistics, how to communicate, right. with. And that's, a fundamental question, because sort of similar to code breaking, in when you are trying to understand something that is encoded and figuring out how to communicate, and also the means of communications might be quite different. And so that was a good movie. And then The Martian was very good, and Gravity I enjoyed as well. But many other films I had a hard time swallowing, so to speak. And I think it's good to have science fiction because it expands our imagination. But the good news is that now we have the capabilities to address this same notion of civilizations out there scientifically. We can just search for their technological signatures. And that's very exciting. Science can be exciting. It doesn't need to be boring. It doesn't need to be full of equations by people that try to promote their self-image and pretending to be very smart. It can be really exciting, a learning experience about what's around us. And there is no bigger question than asking who is around us.
Right. So what can people do? Wrap up here a little bit. First of all, the book, Extraterrestrial, The First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. Obviously, people can get that book and read it. I think it's doing pretty well too. If people want to follow you or follow kind of what's going on in this area, what's the best way for them to do it?
Well, they can just Google my name, Avi Loeb, and so first of all, they will get to my website at Harvard that lists all the scientific publications that I have, but also every week or two I write an essay to Scientific American, and there is a list of all those, and they are timely and they discuss various aspects of the search for life and innovation in general. And then, of course, there are things that were posted over the past 2 months on the web. And, for example, I had a podcast with Lex Friedman that received 1.4 million views. And there was a couple of days ago a post on YouTube by Vice News that received 350,000 views within a couple of days. It's quite remarkable. And there is a huge amount of interest in this subject that I can tell you the public has its heart in the right place.
That's right.
And I very much hope for a better future when the younger generation of today enters the halls of academia.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. The book is Extraterrestrial, the first sign of intelligent life beyond Earth. Avi Loeb, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this has been the Suddenly Richer Podcast. Talk to you next time.